Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, Librarian and Research Associate for the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by Andrew Abela, Founding Dean of the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America. He is also an affiliate faculty member at Harvard University's Human Flourishing Program. And today we're going to be talking about his book, Superhabits, The Universal System for a Successful Life. Andrew, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
Great to be here.
So this book has a very self-help book title. It has, the sticky notes on the cover, and on the back it says self-help and personal growth. And that's true, but I think it's also misleading. So I think this is a self-help and a personal growth and a professional growth book, but I think it's more than that. How do you see it as fitting in that genre? And how does it not fit?
So one of the nicest reviews I got for the book called it a work of deep philosophy masquerading as a self-help book. And so it is deliberately masquerading in the sense that I wanted it to look and feel like a self-help book and read like a self-help book. So in a sense of very practical, easy to read, kind of read it at night when you're going to sleep or read it on the plane, If you read anything by Malcolm Gladwell, that's exactly the style I was going for. So there's lots of stories in the book, as you know, just to make it an entertaining read, because I also written academic books, and you want people to read your books. So actually, it's not academic books, but I write academic journals, and those aren't nearly as readable. Yeah,
absolutely. So it's because one of the first and foremost things it is, and it's a lot of things, and we'll touch on those, is it's a theological account of the virtues. And it relies on some pretty weighty sort of theological background. Now, that is contextualized with great stories, with an engaging writing style, with practical applications. But what's that theological background?
So it is very much in the background. So I wrote it so that even an atheist could read it and kind of accept what's in there. Mm-hmm. Because we had a big debate during the writing project, should we make it explicitly theological or not? Mm-hmm. And we landed on the not, just to give it as wide a possible audience as possible. But it's so the intellectual heavyweight behind it is St. Thomas Aquinas. So Aquinas' treatise on the virtues. So this is, in a sense, a contemporary account of Aquinas' treatise on the virtues. But then he himself is drawing a lot from Aristotle, So his account, in effect, Christianizes Aristotle. But it rests on a view of human nature, right, of human flourishing, that says that we flourish when we live in accord with our design, and that is by kind of living the virtues.
Mm-hmm. And this sort of language is not totally foreign to secular audiences. In fact, there are a lot of secular academics doing, positive psychology, these sort of related movements that are trying to come to a sort of similar account. But I think there are also differences to what you're doing. How does that relate to that literature? Because there's been great popularizations of that literature, and people are talking more about habits, about cultivating character, these sorts of things. But the language of the virtues is either absent or very minimal in that language. How do you account for that?
Yeah, so we're talking about the same thing. So in positive psychology, they occasionally use the word virtue, and by that they mean something similar to our cardinal virtues. But then for what I refer to as the virtues in general, they call them character strengths. But they are talking about habits of excellence. They're talking about generosity and gratitude and courage and so on. So we're talking about the same things, but people don't seem to like the word virtue because they think it has religious connotations, which is funny because the pagans kind of came up with
Yeah.
it, you know. So I actually I cite a lot of the positive psychology work in my book, and in fact, what the book is largely is St. Thomas's treatise on the virtues married to contemporary positive psychology and delivered through stories. That's basically the book.
Yeah. And then there's also another thread, and you talk about this in your introduction, that there's been this sort of like an explosion of literature lately, popular literature and academic literature, about habits as a way to form character, as a way to sort of shape people, to take ownership and shape their own lives in productive ways to help them attain personal, professional success and this sort of thing. How does it relate to that literature?
That literature kind of began the whole thing. Particularly Charles Duhigg's book, The Power of Habit. I remember when I first read it, I thought this is going to be very, very important. You know, and that was 10 some years ago. And then Atomic Habits, James Clear's book, has gone kind of sold 4 or 5 million, I think, copies. That stuff is really important because it recognizes something that had been previously ignored, that habits are the surest form of behavior change. So if we want somebody's behaviors to change, changing one's habits is the secret to doing that. The limitation of that literature, and this is where my book comes in, is it's all about how to grow in a habit, and it says nothing about which habits are worth growing in.
Yeah.
So that's what Superhabits is basically answering the question, well, which habits?
Yeah, and there's another literature that this is engaging in that's a little bit more normative, but in some sort of strange ways, I find, is the sort of rules literature. And you'll get, you'll get books about, 15 rules that women should have when they date that are, like sold, and you have the Jordan Peterson 12 Rules for Life is a big one. And I always thought we already have 10 rules for life. They're in Exodus. But is that a little bit more normative than this other stuff? And how does that fall short?
It's actually the if you took the habits literature and the rules literature and put them together, you would have the virtues.
Yeah.
Because the problem with the rules literature is it gives you the rules, but isn't explicit about the fact that you want to take each of those rules and turn it into a habit. So, for example, I have a Substack on Superhabits called Superhabit, not Superhabits, because that was already taken on Substack. And one of my more recent pieces, I took Peterson's original 12 rules and showed how each of the rules is actually a virtue.
Okay.
And I went through the virtues from the Superhabits book, matched them with each of the 12 rules. So the Atomic Habits is saying, here's how you develop habits. Rules are saying, these are the rules you should follow. Well, turn each of those rules into a habit, and now you have... Because you don't have to keep reminding yourself, rule 1, rule 7. You want it to become part of you, and that's what the habit does.
And you do this, and this is really interesting, is this is what's super about the habits, is there is a normative dimension to the habits. And there's something, there's a normative component to human flourishing and what it is to have success. The notions of success that at least some of this literature, they're pretty amorphous.
Yeah.
Or they're material. What does that good life, what does that account of human excellence that's behind the super habits?
Well, this is really, really important because modern ethics is so confused about this, right? The norms, the normative part of the virtues don't come from some abstract theory, which is how all of modern ethics proceeds, right? You begin with, okay, we're going to be the greatest good for the greatest number. And so now we work out all of our norms from utilitarianism or however you do that. The norms in the virtues and the natural law are discovered, not conceptualized. They're there before we don't begin with an idea and then apply them. We discover them in human nature, right? And the pagans discovered them, and then the Christians kind of adopted them, if you will, or recognized that discovery. So the account the pagan account is limited. The Christian account is broader. So the pagans had no room, say, for a virtue of humility. They thought that was silly.
Yeah.
So we add that as Christians, but they are very practical in the sense as they are a description of what works if you want to be a happy, flourishing human being. These are the habits you should have, right?
Mm-hmm.
Remember the 7 habits of highly successful people?
Yeah.
My book is the 50 habits of flourishing human beings.
Exactly.
And it's not just me saying that. This is Aquinas, and then the positive psychology kind of reinforces or gives you empirical justification, or not justification, empirical support that these things actually work.
Yeah. I actually thought of Covey's 7 Habits book when I was reading this book, because not many people know this, but about 7 years before 7 Habits was published, he published another book called The Divine Center, which was an explicitly Mormon sort of theological account of the sort of habits and virtues. And 7 Habits was a sort of popularization, secularization of that. And it's funny if you look at the 2 books, it's very clear that like the theory is all worked out. And both of them, to Covey's credit, both of them come out of the research he did on his I forget if it was a master's or a PhD dissertation on sort of self-help literature.
Yep. Okay.
But it's a remarkable sort of tracing. I think his repackaging of his more theologically robust account earlier into a more accessible, more popular account that could be embraced and that secular audiences could get something out of as well as religious audiences is very similar. Now, there is, when we talk about the virtues, actually, to take a step back, you talked about how this is in contrast to a lot of, philosophical ethics these days. Utilitarianism was one example. We've also had a resurgence, due in large part to the work of the recently deceased Alistair MacIntyre, of virtue ethics. How does that account of the virtues, is that similarly robust, or is that different in some ways, some important ways from your own project?
It's a very disjointed field, so a lot of it depends on who's writing.
Mm-hmm.
Like MacIntyre himself is terrific. I think it was such a great account of how we lost the idea of virtue. And positive psychology and other areas are just sort of groping back to find that, even if not intentionally. The problems I find with virtue ethics is when virtue ethics sees itself like another theory of ethics. So it becomes yet another set of prescriptions and not a recognition that it's actually a description of our human nature. And so it doesn't make bold enough claims. It's just like, here's another way of looking at things. I remember reading in the virtue ethics literature a long time. And it was not until I read Aquinas that I realized this thing is enormous, and it's so significant. Virtue ethics makes it just seem like a little thing on the side,
Yeah. What's very interesting, there's a structure. I love just looking structurally at books because I think you can tell a lot about an argument. And you hit the ground running. And you hit the ground running with a discussion of 3 virtues before you even get into making a distinction between habits and superhabits. That's that section. And you start with stories, and you start with the virtues themselves. And also, interestingly, you don't start where a lot of literature, even classical literature on the virtues, starts, which is with the 4 cardinal virtues. Those come last, which I think is very interesting. And I think I think your book makes a very compelling case for why to do that. Why are the 4 cardinal virtues last? But they're also the organizing principle. Yeah. We learn later.
Yeah, the 2 reasons. Actually, just one. Mm-hmm. One reason, my wife.
Yeah.
I started to write the book, and she read the first few chapters and said, "This is boring." So I had to put the stories forward to kind of captivate the reader. But more importantly, what I found was when I tried to explain, so it's based on Aquinas' system, and his system is one of progressively finer distinctions within human nature. So he starts with the distinction between our supernatural and natural natures. And so that for the supernatural aspect of our lives, there are the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. And then within the natural, there are the intellectual and practical lives. And for each one of those, he keeps kind of further subdividing and showing what are the proper virtues in each case. I thought that if I started with that, which is, I think, chapter 10 in the book, most people would be turned off. It's just too academic, too much categorization without knowing why this even matters. So what I wanted to do by showing here's one virtue, here's another, is show why this stuff matters so much. So the first 6 chapters, each introduces you to a different virtue. So restraint, and then humility, and then diligence, shows you how much of what you believe about humility or diligence is wrong, why it's really important, what Aquinas says, what the science says, tell you some really interesting stories about them. The stories connect to each other in a certain way, in some cases, and then teach you a little bit about the nature of virtue. Each chapter introduces something else about virtue, so that when you've got through 7 or 8 of them, now you start to understand. And by the time you get to chapter 10, you want to see how it all fits together, and you care. Whereas if I started by explaining how it all fits together, you would say, well, why would I even care?
Yeah. This is also the way that we cultivate the virtues ourselves, is we don't start with a fully realized human excellence and then work out all the details. We don't even start with attaining one of the cardinal virtues. We start at these small, and this is not the word you use, but it's the word they're not sub virtues in the sense of that they're inferior to.
Right.
But they're constituent parts.
Correct. That's
of
exactly
a virtue.
right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Explain sort of how that works, because one of the ways you break it down in the book is all of these ones you start with are particular aspects of self-discipline or temperance.
Yeah, right.
I was taught the virtues by an old monastic who was teaching Latin at a public high school, and so I have all the classical names in my head.
Yeah.
But and that's another thing to talk about is the way that you've relabeled some of these in a way to make them more accessible to a modern audience. But let's start with why you chose to focus on that self-discipline or temperance category first.
So we normally think of them as prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance in that order, with prudence being the highest, or practical wisdom, as I prefer to call it. And it is the highest, right? It's one that orders all the other virtues. But I think it's Augustine who says that while that may be their order in terms of importance, their order in terms of development is almost flipped. That you have to start first by growing in self-discipline. Because if you have no self-discipline, you never even get a chance to exercise the other virtues, because you're just a slave to your passions, And then once you have some self-discipline, you better get some courage, because if you have no courage, then every time you run into a challenge, you fall flat. And so you won't have chance to exercise the other virtues. So once you have self-discipline and courage, then justice and temperance, justice and practical wisdom, or practical wisdom and justice, I think that sequence doesn't matter as much. So I wanted the book to follow the order of development, so that somebody coming in not knowing much about the virtues would kind of see the progression. So restraint is the first chapter, it's the very first virtue, and that's where you begin. So even the 15 virtues that make up practical wisdom, that make up self-discipline, are in a sort of order as well. So that it's kind of, I call them an on-ramp to the virtues,
One of my favorite ways that you talk about self-discipline in the book, and you give a new name to an old virtue, which is gentle firmness, as opposed to meekness. So now, the gentle firm will inherit the earth. And I think your account of that is very good. But I also think that is a great example of why it's very important to maybe freshen up the names of these. Not because those older names were wrong, but just because we've come to associate meanings with them in contemporary English that they never originally had. That's one example of gentle firmness and meekness. What were some other ones that you thought you really have to sort of rebrand this to make it intelligible to an ordinary reader who's not immersed in sort of the Thomistic tradition?
Right, and because sometimes the Thomistic language can be a prison, like a barrier, or walls to keep people out, rather not a prison. So patience was another one. Patience is a virtue. Everyone knows that, right? That's typically how we translate paciencia. But Aquinas' definition of paciencia, which is one of the courage virtues, right? It's one of the parts of courage. His definition is endurance through long sorrow. Nobody thinks of patience that way. Now we think of patience as don't be in a hurry, Yeah. So we have a word that means endurance through long sorrow, and it's resilience. That's exactly what. So in the field of cognitive behavioral therapy, right, where they help people grow in resilience as a treatment for anxiety and depression. Mm-hmm. Anxiety and depression are what Thomas would have called sorrow. Like we have this feeling of deep sadness. Paciencia is the habit of experiencing that deep sadness and then moving forward anyway. And what CBT shows is that actually then starts to reduce the sadness, right? Mm. And so that's what resilience does. So that was a better word, I thought, than patience.
One of the wonderful things about this book is that in every copy in the back, there's one of these, which charts out this entire sort of landscape. And there's a copy of this on your Substack as well.
Correct, yeah.
And we'll put a link to both the Substack and that in the notes. But this is just an immensely rich thing on its own that gives you a sort of arrangement and structure to this whole thing. And this is spelled out in the book.
Correct.
But it's also, how did this come about? Because this is really ingenious, I think.
So this came about because of, we're here in Grand Rapids, because of a Grand Rapids native. I don't know if you know John Birch.
Yes.
He's a good friend of mine. And so this is my attempt to visualize the logic in Aquinas' treatise on the virtues, to show you how all the virtues fit together and what separates them and so on, the logic behind them. The ancients the medievals would draw this as a tree. So we've all seen medieval pictures of the medieval tree of the virtues. But I was trying to make the point that it's complete, and I was struggling, and instead of doing a tree of the virtues, I had something like a squash ladder, or a tennis ladder, or a family tree, if you will. Yeah. And so I was meeting with John. I said, John, I'll show you the latest work that I'm working on. Look at this cool thing from St. Thomas. And I started to tell him about the structure, and I reached into my briefcase to pull out the diagram I had, which was this tree diagram. And he goes, oh, I'm so excited to see this. He goes, I hope it's not some dumb squash ladder thing. And it's like, oh, no. Oops. Actually, yes. So that I took as a challenge to come up with a better way to visualize it. And he was right, because the tree structure, you can always imagine another branch. So there's no sense of completeness. But when I drew it as a circle like this, there's no room to add anything. And there shouldn't be, because it is a complete structure. So the way Aquinas has it, every aspect of your life is covered here. Mm-hmm. So it means no matter what situation you're in, no matter what you're struggling with, you know that there's a virtue for helping you address that. So, yeah.
So this completeness is unique in Thomas. You have particularly unique compared to sort of a lot of the modern literature, in which these categories are admitted even by the researchers themselves to be sort of arbitrary or ad hoc or part of a continuing research program.
Correct.
How does that change how we look at the virtues in a very concrete way? Knowing that what you have a sort of complete account, how does that change the way that you cultivate the virtues, or that you teach the virtues, or you're a university professor engaged in constructive research about this. This changes the way you do research, I'd imagine, as well.
Yeah, it would spare you from wasting time trying to look for other virtues, because it's like there aren't any. That's it, But more important, I think, than anything is it gives you confidence in the framework. Mm-hmm. It says that whatever aspect of life you want to take a virtue perspective on, there will be such a perspective. Because you think through, kind of, is this about intellect or is it about practical life? If it's about practical life, is it about thoughts, actions, or feelings? If it's about feelings, is it about feelings of attraction or desires? Or is it, and going through all of these if, and in every case, that distinction is complete and non-overlapping. which is how we know it's a complete system. The analogy I use in the book, you may remember, is the one of the 20 questions.
20 questions,
yeah.
yes.
Because if you remember, the way to win 20 questions, so it's the game of somebody thinks of something and you have 20 questions to guess it. And you think, how could you possibly win that? There's millions of things in the world, But the answer is every time you ask a question, you have to have it such that the yes or no will divide the universe of remaining possibilities into two.
Mm-hmm.
So is it smaller than a bread box, yes or no? And then if the answer is yes, then you know that everything the same size or larger than a bread box is excluded. And so 2 to the power of 20 is just over 1 million. So you could, from over 1 million objects, you could get down to the right thing. And that's exactly what he's doing with his with this framework. Because it's like, is it this or that? Is it this or that? So that you'll always end up with a virtue. There's no danger of ending up with, okay, here's a place where there's no room for virtue. That would never happen.
Yeah. So let's make this in the spirit of the virtues, in the spirit of St. Thomas. Let's make this very concrete. You are Dean of the Bush School at Catholic University of America. What are some ways at CUA that you are working with this model? With students, with faculty, with business leaders that you're coming into contact with through programming. What does it look like when you teach this framework, and then when we go to the level of application? When all of a sudden you teach them this framework, they get the chart, they get some excellent concrete examples in the book, and then they want to actually go out and cultivate these virtues. How are you doing that in the context of CUA and the work of the Bush School there?
Yeah, so there's a number of different ways in terms of choosing the virtues. For our students, we have this thing called the Bush Virtue Diagnostic, which if you Google that, you can find it. And the answer series of questions, and it will suggest a virtue to work on. We have an app. We, in this case, not the Bush School, but myself. The app is called Grow Virtue. It's on the Apple App Store and on Google Play. And it also has a diagnostic, which helps you figure out which virtues you should be working on. But then in terms of how to actually develop them, the approach we're taking in the business school, which we're now spreading over the whole of Catholic University, we got a $1 million grant to do that, to help faculty. We integrate the practice of different virtues. So here we're taking the atomic habits idea of a little bite every day. And so the idea is most curricula are already full. You can't add more stuff. So we take homework that they're going to do anyway and identify the virtue that they would be practicing by doing this homework. So it's a team project, so you'll be practicing the virtue of friendliness, for example. Or it's accounting homework, you'll be practicing the virtue of orderliness. And then we give them a thing that they're going to be practicing while they do that homework as a way to grow in the virtue. In a business, we'll do something similar. We'll identify what's a business problem they're trying to solve. So it has something to do with, say, execution. It's going to be some aspect of self-discipline. So there'll be some exercise that they will do every day, a few minutes a day, to start cultivating that virtue.
One of the things that Stephen Covey, in the beginning of that 7 Habits book and in the Divine Center book and out of his research, is he talked about how there was an earlier understanding, a sort of pre-20th century understanding in sort of the self-help literature about fixating on what you're trying to cultivate as excellence. And it was, in some way, various frameworks, not all strictly Thomistic accounts or anything like that. But then in the latter half, in the end of the 19th century through the beginning of the 20th century, what he saw was the rise of things that were just technical. Of just sort of like what we would call today sort of like life hacks. Is like, you always say somebody's name repeatedly is a classic example of, how to win friends and influence people. That Dale Carnegie sort of, and not to say that Dale Carnegie's wrong. People do like to hear their name and they like to know that you remember them and the rest of it. But you got focused very on that technique thing. And I see this also in businesses and nonprofits, et cetera, when they try to do professional development for folks, is all of a sudden it's okay, we're going to give you this flow chart that you can run decisions through, or different ways that you can track metrics. And it's not about actually developing the person. How do you see that? I mean, because there's a theological background here, but this is also like addressing very real needs among students who are trying to learn, among employees that are trying to be productive employees and generate value for their employers, among employers and managers who are trying to act responsibly and magnanimously to their employees. How does this fit into that larger debate? Because I think it's very unique. People talk a lot about principles in leadership, this sort of, but it quickly becomes very abstract and very technical and divorced from the human person.
The difference, I think, so the beauty of virtue is it is simultaneously always practical and moral.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, being courageous as a leader, is that a practical thing or is it the right thing to do? Well, it's certainly very practical. If you're not courageous, you won't be a successful leader. It's also the moral thing to do, it's because if you're not standing up, if you're not being courageous as a leader, you will fail, and therefore, in every case, it's both moral and practical. The difference between a virtue and a technique is a virtue is always aligned with our human nature, and so the more we grow in virtue, the happier we become. So we become more effective and we become happier, as the positive psychology research shows. Whereas skills, techniques, maybe they help you, maybe they don't, but they're not connected with your happiness. As you develop habits, you develop new pathways in your brain. But when you develop the virtues, in a sense, what you're doing is you're following pathways that are already there and deepening them, because they're already natural to us. I like to make the analogy, it's an old analogy, of the virtues with muscles. These are mental muscles we didn't even know we had. We just exercise them and they start to get stronger, versus a technique which is just something foreign to you that you're just going to add on and hopefully it'll be useful. A technique is a tool for a toolkit. A virtue is a muscle that you already have. That
Mm-hmm.
makes sense? Yeah.
No, that makes perfect sense. If someone is at home, you mentioned the app and the diagnostic that might be able to help people where to start. If you go up, if we were to go upstairs right now and look at my desk, it would be very clear that orderliness needs to be cultivated. There are some things that are obvious. There are some things that are less obvious to people. This is one of the challenges, is how to develop that reflective quality, how to develop those insights. How do those diagnostic tools you've developed help people do that? I guess so. If somebody wanted to go and start, finding something to focus on this afternoon after they listen to this podcast, there's some helpful tools out there. But what's the sort of just general process of inquiry that somebody should do?
The thing I find most helpful is figure out which part of your life are you struggling with most. Do you struggle with fear and anxiety? Do you struggle with ego? Do you struggle with being disorganized? Do you wish you had more creativity? Do you wish you had more friends? Whatever area you most want to improve in your life, there's going to be a virtue that will help you do that. That's where you begin. Because the important thing with a virtue, there are two important things. One is find something that you want to do better. Because if you don't have that desire, then you're never going to get started. But then the second thing is, you may want it a lot, but you have to be willing to start with a very small step. Because usually the way people fail is they try something grandiose, and then they try it for 2 or 3 days, and then it's too much work. So you pick the smallest possible thing that's actually going to make progress, and you do that every day. The analogy I give in the book is of somebody who wanted to exercise and never could stick with an exercise. So he just decided to do 1 push-up every morning, just 1. And then while he was down there, he soon found he could do 2 and then 3 and then 10. And now I think he does 100, So he's well on his way. And that's a good analogy, I think. So whatever the virtue would be. So, for example, humility. I got this from some of the research studies. If you want to grow in humility, once a day, when you're facing whatever decision you're facing, make a list of all the things you don't know with respect to that decision. Guaranteed to help you grow in humility. Just a little thing like that. Do that every day for 30, 50, 60 days, and becomes a habit.
There's another thing when I was reading this book that I thought about. Years ago, maybe just 2 years ago, there was a story in Politico about Arthur Brooks, who actually gives a very generous little blurb on this book, and whose work is great, and he focuses a lot on how to cultivate happiness in his work at Harvard these days.
Yep.
And the reporter at Politico had asked Arthur Brooks a question of sort of why did he get into the happiness business? He came out of sort of, he had been head of the American Enterprise Institute. he had been involved in this sort of political world, and he had transitioned, out of that and into a more academic, more happiness focused. Although he did a lot of that work at AEI well,
yep.
to his credit. But he told the reporter that you need a supply of ideas, but if you really, really want to change culture, you need to stimulate demand for better things in life. That's how you do it. That's how Martin Luther King did it. That's how Gandhi did it. You gave a talk this afternoon, which we will also link to in the show notes. Hopefully it'll be ready then at our annual academic colloquium, in which you talked about some of your work. And one of the things that you talked about was the power for this sort of thing to transform society and to renew virtue. This isn't just about business, although it has business applications. This isn't just about improving the lives of students. This isn't even just about improving our own personal happiness. How do you think about this in terms of as something that can help cultivate broader social change?
This is probably a bold statement, but I think pretty much every social problem we face right now, whether it's the sort of pandemic of anxiety and depression among young people, the decline of marriage, the decline of civility where neighbor doesn't talk to neighbor because of who you voted in the last election, all of these things can be not entirely solved, but can be improved dramatically through growth in virtue. Every one of these sort of human failings that just seems to be so endemic now is a lack of virtue. And it's not a surprise because the schools don't teach this anymore. Churches hardly teach it. Families don't pass it on. So we're seeing the consequences. And in some of my writing, not in the book, I refer to the virtues as the human operating system that underlie everything that we do. And we know what happens when you don't update the operating system on your phone or your laptop. Things start to slow down. They don't work as well. You get more easily hacked. And I think that's what's happened to our society. Our human operating system is desperately in need of an upgrade. We need an infusion, an increase in virtue.
Andrew, I wanted to conclude by talking about, I'd mentioned, some of the folks with more open-ended conception of the virtues talk about it in terms of a research program. But there's still a research program in here. Mm-hmm. It's just a defined research program. And as I read this book, I thought there's a couple sequels that could easily come out of it, because you spend a lot of time on sort of the constituent virtues of self-discipline in here. But you could do a courage volume going through all of those. You could do a practical wisdom, a justice, one on the intellectual and spiritual life. Do you have any plans to do any of those? Where is your thinking these days on that? Because as I was reading this, I'm like, this is wonderful. I want more of it. And I see, because I have the chart, what it could be. Do you have any plans for anything like that in the future?
My wife said if I try to write another book, she will leave me.
Oh, no.
I'm kidding. She would never do that, and she would never say that, but she did want me to think twice before writing another book. Because recall, my day job is running the business school, so I have a very busy job already. Finding time to write is hard. On average, I've written 3 books over 30 years, so one every 10 years. So maybe I'll have another one 10 years from now or 9 years from now. I would, however, be very happy to support anybody who wanted to write that kind of book. Right now, my focus is taking these ideas and driving them into practice, particularly in business. So I'm working with some businesses that are interested and always looking to help more companies do that. If I do write another book, I would like it to be filled with actual case examples of companies that I've worked with to show this is how you do it. The stories in this book came from research, from history, and so on. The next one I'd love to be stories of, okay, here's a company I worked with, and this is what they did.
We look forward to hearing those stories. Thank you so much for giving us help in cultivating the virtues in our own life, and then by turn, bringing the virtues more to the forefront of our society. And, we could see some really positive change, and you have given people some excellent tools. Thank you so much for your work, your research, and your writing. Thank you for being with us on Acton.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.